Okay, so I'm making the next presentation as well, and it's around our clinic process for obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, some of the breakthroughs we've made and some case studies around that as well. So before I start, the material that I'm going through is not a substitute for medical attention. So I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a trauma therapist and peak states therapist who's been trained in the ISPS psychoimmunology framework, as well as our trauma therapy and peak states processes. So that means I'm not licensed to diagnose medical conditions. So any of the suggestions in this talk are not intended as a substitute for consultation with your healthcare provider, and I cannot give any advice around medication for OCD. If you have symptoms that resemble a case in this presentation, there's no guarantee that you'll get the same results as described here. One of the reasons why our clinic offers pay for results treatments. So what I'm going to cover in the talk today, yesterday I talked about how our psychoimmunology framework was significantly progressing over the last 2.5 years. And then not surprisingly, some of our processes are mapping that. So I'm going to talk about how our OCD clinic processes have been improving over the last couple of years. Then I'm going to go through some case studies for 2 of the different types of OCD symptoms. One of them is around fear-based compulsions and the other one around contamination fear. And then more recently, we've had a breakthrough around intrusive thoughts and also give some case studies around that. And then I'll talk through what we would like some of the next steps to be. So our OCD clinic processes, our clinic delivers processes on a pay for results basis for 3 different types of OCD symptoms. So basically, if we're not able to help our clinic client eliminate the symptoms that they've come to, or at least achieve the outcome that we've agreed on, then they don't pay for the treatment at all. So the first one's around fear-based compulsions. So this is the type of symptoms where there's excessive checking, consistently checking whether the oven's being turned off, or consistently checking whether the door is closed, or it could also be obsessive routines, that things have to be done in a certain way for you to actually feel okay, as a way of releasing an underlying sense of fear or anxiety. So both of the checking and the routines, there's this generalized feelings of fear or anxiety that's driving that checking or the routines, which is a way to try and alleviate that. It doesn't actually eliminate it, but it kind of makes it a little bit more manageable. Then the other type of symptoms around contamination fear. So this is the example where there's either excessive hand washing and maybe excessive cleaning. And again, this is driven by fear, but it's specifically fear around being contaminated. I touched a door handle, I shook hands with someone, anything where, or even just seeing something that you think might be contaminated can actually set off this contamination fear for these type of clients. And then more recently, we've developed a treatment which is around intrusive thoughts. So this is where you get these obsessive but irrational thoughts. Once they get triggered, it's like you can't get them out of your head. And the cases that we've looked at, and some of them have been triggered just after birth. So we think at the moment, we haven't tested this, but we think there's a good chance that this might also be the same cause for some postpartum anxiety. So here's a bit of a timeline around how our OCD clinic processes have been improving over time. So back in 2018, we were using more of a psychobiology process. So regressing back to a key development event, healing some trauma around that we believed was contributing to the OCD symptoms that we're trying to address. And back then, it was only the generalized fear and anxiety symptoms, or the contamination fear symptoms. And so we had a few versions of that, and we were getting some success with that. Then it was around March 2020, so not long after our first breakthroughs around our psychoimmunology treatment. OCD was one of the processes that we tested this on first. Now, at the time, we were getting some good results. in that the symptoms were actually being eliminated during the session. So it looked really promising. But then months later, we actually figured out sometimes that those symptoms were coming back. And as we got a much better understanding around our psychoimmunology framework, we actually figured out that what we were doing in that first psychoimmunology process was actually just getting rid of the toxins being released by the pathogen as opposed to the pathogen themselves. So then it was around April last year where we designed a different psychoimmunology process, and this improved the effectiveness of the treatments. And then a few months after that, we then developed a third process where this was eliminating the pathogen for those fear-based compulsions and contamination. So now we weren't just getting rid of the toxins. Now we actually had a process that was getting rid of the pathogen itself. So more likely to be a permanent solution. Then there was a few months after that that we developed a treatment for intrusive thoughts. Now, up until this point, in my previous talk, I was mentioning around our silent mind process and the mind chatter, and our silent mind process actually has you left feeling with a much more quieter mind. And so we assumed that that was probably what was contributing to the intrusive thoughts that OCD clients were reporting. But in September, we actually discovered that wasn't the case. And then earlier this year, the end of last year, for about 6 months, Grant, Kirsten, and Mary, key members of our core research team, were given feedback around a number of the psychoimmunology processes that some of the clients either couldn't complete the process, or some of the clients felt like they were complete, but then some of the symptoms came back later. We figured out that there was a form of resistance that Mary was touching on yesterday. And so they developed a fairly simple process that added a step to the process that made it much more effective. Not that it's eliminated the resistance for all of our clients for doing this, but it certainly improved our success rates. So let me go through, so that's kind of been the journey that we've been on. Let me go through some case studies to give you an idea as to how this has been working. So in our early treatment, so more using the, where in hindsight, we now would say we're actually just getting rid of the toxin. So we had one guy that I worked with, his key symptoms were he had these particular rituals that he just had to do to ward off anxiety. So had to open doors in a particular way, checking whether the oven was turned on or off, or turning the taps on and off. So that one of those common type of symptoms with the compulsions to try and alleviate the fear or anxiety. So we did a psychobiology process with him. And the outcomes for him were that the anxiety permanently reduced. So it wasn't eliminated, but it certainly reduced. And that was a few years ago, I think I worked with him on that. So he was one of the early clients. And I recently checked in with him again. I've been checking in with him over time to check stability. And the rituals permanently stopped. And because the anxiety got down to a manageable level, he didn't have to do the rituals to try and manage that. And something we weren't necessarily expecting to happen, but that he reported, was he used to stutter quite frequently, and now that is also significantly reduced. We don't exactly know why that was the case, but it was a great additional benefit that he received from the treatment as well. Then in another case study, this time a woman who got referred to me. So she had this generalized anxiety, so more from a physical sensation perspective, so her heart would flutter and have the heart palpitations. And so we did the OCD process because the person who referred her to me had done some trauma healing with her around anxiety, which usually is pretty effective. but we know sometimes when trauma healing is not helping with anxiety, that it could be because of one of the OCD processes could actually help. So I did the second version of our psychoimmunology process with her, and the anxiety has significantly reduced. So again, it was, I'm trying to remember if it was a year or two ago. Oh, it was nearly about 18 months ago, it was actually, that I did the treatment with her, and that significant reduction in the anxiety has been permanent, been a significant change in her life. She even started dating, which she said would not have happened before she actually did this treatment, and met her now husband. So that was a lovely story to hear when I followed up with her to check for the stability of the process as well. So that's just a couple of examples. There were more I could have told, but just a couple of examples of the OCD, generalized fear and anxiety that quite often drives these compulsions and routines. So then around the contamination fear. Now, these ones I wanted to demonstrate not only what happened with the earlier processes, but with these couple of people that I did the work with, they also have done the latest process as well, and getting to see what the change was in doing the updated process with them as well. So the first one with this woman, she had strong feelings of contamination, which meant that she was constantly avoiding certain things, and also had contamination fears around her daughter as well. And so she did the original psychobiology process, but then, like I said, also did our latest version as well. So the outcomes with her was, after just doing the psychobiology process, her contamination fear permanently reduced, for quite some time, months, if not a year or two, that it was reduced to, again, to a manageable level. So it didn't bother her a great deal, but she knew it was there. But before, it really had a significant impact on her life, whereas now it wasn't really impacting at all. But then when we came up with the new treatments, checked to see if she wanted to test the latest version as well, which she did. And now that she's completed our latest process, she now no longer avoids any of the things that she would not have been able to do. Something like going to a public toilet was just something she would definitely avoid because of the fear of contamination, whereas it's still not a pleasant experience, but she doesn't have the contamination fear, so she doesn't have to avoid things like public toilets and raw meat. So that was a good outcome for her. Then another case study, the key kind of issues here was excessive cleaning and hand washing due to the contamination fear. So this is kind of typical type of symptoms that we'd see. She initially did the second psychoimmunology process, and then again also got the opportunity to test our latest process. So similar, the first process that she did with our second psychoimmunology process, again, the contamination fear permanently reduced. It wasn't gone altogether, but it was reduced to a manageable level that it wasn't as much a concern for her anymore. But then when we tested the latest process with her, the contamination fear now is gone altogether. So a good improvement in the process there. So then, like I said, we then had a breakthrough around intrusive thoughts. As I mentioned, initially we assumed that intrusive thoughts were what we call ribosomal voices. And the underlying mechanism for that is a fungus that I talked about, that our silent mind process eliminates. But in this particular situation, there was a member of our staff, so they'd completed the silent mind process, so they didn't actually have ribosomal voices, and yet the obsessive intrusive thoughts got triggered with the birth of her son. Consciously the thoughts she knew were not rational, but she just could not switch off the obsessive intrusive thoughts. So she thought her son was going to die, thought her husband was going to harm him. Just couldn't get these out of her head. So as I was mentioning, as a result of this being the trigger moment, we think there's a good chance that there could be the same cause for postpartum anxiety as well, but we need to do some more research on that. So the great thing about having our psychoimmunology framework is that we were able to very quickly develop a research process, and that immediately stopped the intrusive thoughts. So I'll give you a couple more case studies. So once we had that process, I wanted to then start testing that with others and now with clients as well. So another woman who also, this was years ago, but her intrusive thoughts also got triggered by postpartum anxiety. And she had done the third psychoimmunology process, and then again afterwards was offered to do our latest process. So her intrusive thoughts definitely reduced after the first process. But if she kind of went back to that postpartum kind of trigger moment and re-experience that, she could still feel some anxiety in that moment. So it wasn't permanently gone. Whereas now, after doing the latest process, she no longer experiences the intrusive thoughts at all, including when she regresses back to that postpartum trigger moment. So that looks like a more effective solution there. And then a male client where in this situation, the trigger was actually to do with his mother. So this started when he was a child. And then ever since a situation where from a distance saw a car go past his mother, didn't hit her at all, but it just created this obsessive thoughts that his mother was going to die. And again, couldn't kind of switch this off. So in his situation, it was only fairly recent. So it was straight to doing the latest process, and those intrusive thoughts were completely gone with our new process. So that's looking very good. So some of the conclusions from that. So with our early versions of our OCD clinic processes, typically it seemed to be giving a significant reduction in the symptoms, and that most of the time that was permanent. There were some times where the symptoms partly, or I think one or two cases where it did completely come back, but it still was pretty high success rate. As far as getting to a manageable situation, the clients were still really happy with that outcome. Whereas now we can see with our latest versions of our clinic processes for all three situations, for the fear-based compulsions and routines, for the contamination fear compulsions, and for the intrusive thoughts, all of those now are getting high success rate with our clients. The only issue we have now, so addressing the resistance issue that was being researched for 6 months last year, seems to increase. It certainly has increased the number of clients that can complete the process and have the outcomes that we're looking for. But we still have some clients that are, there's still some form of resistance. So there is some more research that needs to be done there. So next steps is obviously to continue the research on the resistance in completing our clinic processes, that some of our clients still exist. There are a couple of our research clients where their symptoms return. So we plan to do the latest process with them to see whether that can get them a stable outcome. We'll obviously continue to monitor the long-term results because we not only want to get to the root cause and eliminate the issue, we also want that to be a permanent solution. That's always what we're aiming for with all of our work. And then as we continue to do research and continue to improve the percentage of clients that complete the process, then we'll continually update our clinic process with those research findings. And we would like to publish an article at some stage, but I'm not sure when we'll actually get around to that. Okay, there's a lot of people that I'd like to acknowledge for the amazing work that's contributed to these highly successful OCD clinic processes. So none of this would be possible without our two co-directors of research, Dr. Kirsten Lugagar and Dr. Grant McFedridge, who's also our founder. So they've been key to developing the framework and training 8 of our certified therapists in this psychoimmunology framework. And as a result of that, those students out of that research training are now developing treatments themselves without Grant or Kirsten being directly involved in the research, which is the first time that's actually happened the history of the Institute. So it's great from a scaling perspective now. And Mary has been working very closely with Grant and Kirsten around that resistance issue, and she also helps develop quite a number of these psychoimmunology treatments, specifically around the OCD treatments that we came up with. Jennifer and Dean Beattie have worked on all of those treatments, and Julian and Rita also helped with some of those processes as well. And then none of the psychoimmunology breakthroughs would have happened if it wasn't for our core research team, who for roughly about a decade, most of these research staff were working on some of our earlier discoveries, which were then kind of built on. So Lars in Norway, naming down in Australia, Agata in the Canary Islands, Inka is now in Ghana, Samsara down in Australia, Lila in Denmark, and Grażyna in Poland. So really want to thank all of those research staff. All of our research staff work as volunteers. It's incredible the work they do. They do the research because they believe in the vision and the purpose of the organization. So I really want to thank them for the time that they've put into helping us with getting to the point we're at with our OCD treatments. So if you want to find out more information, you can go to our clinic website, which is peakstatesclinics.com, where you can find out not just about our OCD, but other clinic treatments. There's lots of information on our research website, peakstates.com. Our training website is subcellular psychobiology, given that's a core part of what you learn in our trauma therapy training. And then if you want to find an independent certified therapist, either for trauma therapy or for our peak states therapy, then you can go to peakstatestherapy.com. And then we're also on social media. So Institute Peak States is our YouTube channel. There's also one in French. Peak States Therapy is our Facebook page. Again, there's also one in French. And I think the Polish teams, I think, might also have a YouTube and Facebook channel as well. And then if you want to contact me directly, it's Shayne, SHAYNE, @peakstates.com.